To lead in a values-led way is hard because you have to make hard choices. So when you kind of operate in that environment, understanding your true north is incredibly important.
Welcome to a brand new episode of Starts at the Top, our podcast about leading differently. I'm Zoe Amma.
And I'm Paul Thomas. Our podcast exists to help leaders and their teams understand what they need to do differently today to prepare for the world of tomorrow. We started Starts at the Top as a podcast about digital disruption, but we soon realised that leaders were telling us about something more important and urgent, about how traditional ways of leading had changed forever.
We make it our mission to speak to leaders who are carving out new ways of leading, and we cover topics from emerging tech to inclusion, from remote work to mental health and climate change. Basically, all the subjects that today's leaders need to be across in 2024.
And this isn't about shiny corporate case studies, it's about lessons learned and progress made the hard way, and crucially, how that can inspire others. And my goodness, if I read that as a briefing, do we have an episode for you today that lives up to that mission? Last week, Zoe and I had a conversation with Sal Naseem, who is the former Regional Director for London at the Independent Office for Police Conduct, and the author of a new book, True North, A Story of Racism, Resilience and Resisting Systems of Denial. Sal was at the Independent Office for Police Conduct during some horrific cases, from Wayne Couzens and his rape and murder of Sarah Everard to the prosecution of the two officers taking selfies at the murder scene of Nicole Smallman and Bibba Henry. His tenure also coincided with George Floyd's murder, when police accountability became a global issue. His story took our breath away, and so we wanted to share it with you as soon as we could. And Zoe, this was one of those instances where the questions we prepared in advance took a bit of a back seat to allowing Sal all the space that he needed to tell his story. In fact, I think I left you to it, and one question from me in the middle, because it was just a privilege to listen to the two of you, quite frankly.
Sorry, I just got a dare running up and down the stairs. It was such a privilege to speak to Sal because I've been following him on LinkedIn for some time, and those of you who do follow him there will know that he says some incredibly fascinating and honest home truths about inclusion. And it was such an honour to talk to him and to hear his story, which obviously he outlines in more detail in his wonderful book. So thank you so much, Sal, for sharing your experiences and really just owning all the really difficult things that have happened to him and making sense of them in such an eloquent and moving way that's been really thought through and very carefully considered as a way to help other people. And that's what I really took away from the book, that even in the most difficult of situations, there's always something you can do in terms of how you view the situation and the actions you take, and also what values you hold yourself accountable for. So thank you, Sal. It's definitely been one of my favourite conversations we've ever had on the pod.
Yeah, and hugely affecting. So hopefully our listeners think so too. And we'll get to that in just a second. And sort of speaking of places where there is indefensible behaviour and worrying surroundings, we, since the last episode, I think have made a bit of a move away, like many people, in what I'm calling the Great Twitter or X resignation. It seemed to happen overnight that people in my social media network decided that enough was enough and left the platform in their droves. Now, mostly heading to Blue Sky, which seems to be the place where people are sort of taking root. I think I tried Threads for a while, but it never really took with me, so I've not really done anything on there. And I've decided to leave my Twitter there because I don't want to lose access until it literally turns into nothing useful at all. I don't really want to lose access to the contact names and the content that I shared over the years. But yeah, setting up on Blue Sky and not really having the time to invest massively in it yet, but wanted to see what you thought of it and what you'd made of your early experiments in Blue Sky.
So there seemed to be a lot of charity people on there, which I was very pleased to see. So I have to say the decision I made to join was quite of the moment. I noticed lots of people from the sector were getting on there and not being nearly as active on X, which I totally understand. And I very rarely proactively post on there now. I'm keeping my account open in case things change in the future. But Blue Sky was quite interesting joining it because it did feel like the early days of X again, as in that excitement to see everyone and people being friendly and helpful. I guess the question is always, as with Threads, whether that momentum and that energy is sustained and what value people start to get from the platform. That's the thing that will truly help it scale. I'm also very mindful, and I don't want to sound like a massive cynic, because I very much am not one of those. But I think we need to see this as a new thing and a new channel, rather than chasing after the glory days of that lovely feeling we all had in the first days of X. Because I just think it was a very, very distinct and specific moment in time of digital evolution. It's no coincidence that the rise of X happened at the same time as the rise of the smartphone. And it was a time when there were less platforms and people were using them in very different ways. So I think it's really key to consider why you're on there and what you want to get out of it.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think obviously things have moved on quite significantly. The world is a different place. Social media is a very different place. And I think you're absolutely right. The people that are sort of opening it up and expecting it to be a direct translation of what they were doing on Twitter is probably enough reason not to be there. I think what we ought to be doing is looking at it and thinking, yeah, what do I want this space to be? Because for me in particular, I'm not sure I have the energy for social media in the way that I used to in the past. And I think that's the bit that I'm most mindful of, is keeping the energy, and therefore following and connecting to the people and the things that I really am interested in and want to hear about, which isn't always the same as where it started. It started for me very much from a work perspective. It was when I started on X, it was about work, and it was then that through work I started to find connections into other spaces. And now I'm not sure it's the same. Now I'm thinking it might be stuff where I want to follow more about music and sport and the things that I'm interested in rather than work. But I'll see. I'm going to take, I think, a bit of time over the Christmas break when it gets here to spend a bit of time looking at it and playing with it and figuring out whether that's a place where I want to spend some time. But I completely agree with you. Don't just go into there and replicate what you had on X, because it's a different place, and it would be good to make sure it stays at least a different place.
Absolutely.
So now for our interview with Sal Naseem, and it feels appropriate to just put a trigger warning in front of this. I think Sal talks a lot about racist behaviour that he's experienced both in his childhood and in the workplace. We hear quite a bit about institutional racism and bullying, and it just feels fair to put that trigger warning in front of the episode so you can make your decision. I don't think there's anything in here that is immediately triggering in the way that we've heard in some of our other episodes, but I think it's only fair to say that this might we got emotional when we were talking to Sal, so there might be some emotion attached to this. So now for our interview with Sal Naseem.
We are very excited to welcome Sal Naseem to the podcast today. Sal is the former Regional Director for London at the Independent Office for Police Conduct, where he spent the best part of a decade. Sal has worked on some of the most high-profile misconduct cases featuring the Metropolitan Police Service in recent years, and broader work addressing cultural issues in policing. Sal holds a range of roles which centre on cultural and systemic change at a regional and national level. Sal has been recognised as one of the top 10 voices in the world on anti-discrimination on LinkedIn by Falvicon in 2024. Honoured as one of the 50 most influential people driving change in the UK through inclusion in the Diversity Power List 2023 to 2024. He's also contributed to several BBC documentaries on policing and is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. Sal is very much our kind of guest at Starts at the Top. Sal, welcome. Thank you so much for making the time to be here today.
It's lovely to be here, Zoe, and have the chance to speak to you.
We're so happy that you're here because we were both really moved by your book. And before we started recording today, we talked about the honesty and the rawness of it and how you've really put so much of yourself and your experiences in it. And we were really struck by the intensity of the experiences that you had, particularly during your time at the Independent Office for Police Conduct, during some really horrific cases, from Wayne Couzens to the prosecution of the two officers taking selfies at the murder scene of Nicole Smallman and Bieber Henry. And it really struck me when we first spoke a few weeks ago, and also reading the book, how extraordinary and how intense and challenging, with a capital C, all of those experiences must have been. What was it like to work in that kind of environment?
Difficult, incredibly difficult, but it's not something I appreciated fully at the time. I left my role last year, and I think now that I've had some distance, I can appreciate actually it wasn't normal. I think it's hard to describe, to be honest, Zoe, the intensity of it. I occupied a role which was always contentious, was always high profile as regional director for London at the IOPC. But in 2020, when about just a year after taking post, the world changed. COVID hit. You had the murder of George Floyd in that May. Then you had the Black Lives Matter protests. And this concept and this difficult relationship between race and policing, which has been the story for decade after decade, suddenly became top of the global news agenda. And here I was occupying this position in the UK in a really high profile role. And then I had oversight of the Metropolitan Police. And it's maybe kind of easy to forget, but in that period, there was scandal after scandal after scandal, tragedy after tragedy, difficult case after difficult case, always centering around the Metropolitan Police. Very often, black communities were at the heart of it, but also there was also cases involving the culture within the Met and its own police officers. And I was occupying one of the most senior positions in England and Wales in the system that I was in. I had a seat at the table and a unique opportunity to try and drive change as best as I could through the vantage point that I had in the system that I had. But to drive change in a system which has always resisted change, and these issues have been internally spoken about, as I said, decade after decade, my experiences have led me to appreciate how difficult that is, and actually why change is so glacial that it's imperceptible. You asked me how it was, the experience, and I have to tell you, I didn't appreciate how difficult it was until I started writing the book. And the book that I've written was actually a process of healing for me, as I discovered. I thought I would just write down stuff to get out of my head. But by the time I'd written it, it had become an entirely different book. And writing the chapters revealed to me what I had experienced, and I had to confront things that I hadn't wanted to confront before. And the experience, as I said, was brutal, and the experience nearly broke me. And I don't say that easily. I don't sit here claiming victimhood. I don't sit here wanting to wallow in it. I sit here speaking to you about these experiences almost uncomfortably. I am uncomfortable actually, but writing and shedding light on this system to me was important because people don't understand. And I wanted to just kind of lift the lid on it a little bit, so people can actually learn the lessons for me that worked, but also where it didn't work and where I fell down, so that people can even take one thing from the book. Then to me, the effort and the hardship in writing it would have been worth it.
I think that's such a courageous way to deal with trauma, not to run from it, as is, I think, the natural human inclination, but just to really lean into it and own it and make it part of your story. And as someone who's also a person of colour, I really want to thank you for that, because it's going to help so many people, and it's going to really create so much more understanding of what it's like to operate as a person of colour in a very challenging environment where you're a minority. And it strikes me when you were talking there, and also when we were reading your fantastic book, that what felt so challenging, and I wanted to see if this is how you saw it, you were right at the nexus of this change, weren't you? So you were there when this social contract with policing was starting to shift and really kind of come into question with the murder of Sarah Everard and everything else that was going on. And then meanwhile, society was starting to shift as well, you know, in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. And you were absolutely at the epicenter of where that change is happening. And it's like trying to straddle the fault line in an earthquake. It's really hard. And wow, I'm just in awe of the way you managed to deal with it and navigate your way through it.
It was a really complicated set of experiences, a really complicated set of experiences. And I've tried to capture that in my writing, because I think it's very easy, although the cover is black and white of my book, and that alludes to the issues around race and racism, the experiences aren't black and white. They aren't black and white, they're more nuanced. For instance, I didn't expect the biggest challenge in doing my role to be my own organisation. I didn't expect that. I expected it to be the Metropolitan Police. And yet having kind of left that system, you know, I have more contact and, you know, really good relations with serving and former police officers than I do from, you know, kind of members of my former organisation. That's not to decry everybody that worked there. That is, it's not that. But, you know, my phone book tells me that, you know, between the academics, the charities, the experts, the community activists, the police officers, senior individuals in the criminal justice system that I have very good relations with, that tells me how I approach the job. It tells me how I approach the job. And, you know, you mentioned this, you used a really good phrase, Zoe, social contract, how the social contract, you know, became broken. I would argue actually slightly differently. I think the social contract between policing and particularly black communities has been broken for decades, but it's just never acknowledged. It's just never at the top of the agenda to be looked at and mended in the way that it needs to be. But what's happened, you know, in my tenure was that this issue around male violence against women and girls, you know, and the Sarah Everard tragedy, you know, brought that into the epicenter of the debate, and it provoked a different debate, and it sparked something else. These issues are always there, as you know, the misogyny, sadly, that I kind of seen too often across my desk was part and parcel of some of the really difficult things I had to deal with. But you also had issues around, you know, from the Stephen Port murders, and you know, the homophobia and the institutionalized homophobia. So what happened was the social contract, I think, has been broken between policing and most acutely black communities for decades. But what happened then was fissures and fractures happened in a wider section of the community with women and girls and with the LGBTQ plus community. So then it became a different sort of debate. It widened, and it wasn't as easy to marginalize some of the conversations that needed to happen. So it was a really kind of profound time to be doing the job that I was doing and being involved in the conversations that I was, and some of the pieces of work that I, you know, was kind of privileged to lead.
Yeah, and that absolutely resonates, you know, that real clarity of thought you had and the decisions that you made, some really brave and difficult decisions, where again you were in to echo the title of the book, really following your true north and trying to do what was right, even though that was a very hard, very difficult thing to do and left you personally exposed. Would you feel comfortable to talk a bit about your role in Operation Houghton, because that really struck me as an example of that?
So Operation Houghton started off as an independent investigation that the IOPC started because there was allegations that police officers from the Metropolitan Police, predominantly based in Charing Cross Police Station, were having sex with members of the public. Now, ultimately, we didn't find evidence to support that, but when my team started investigating, what we did find was a really toxic culture inside the Metropolitan Police. And what started off as one independent investigation became 9 separate investigations, which took, about a year and a half to complete. So the range of allegations, let me kind of just describe it from the start. These investigations concerned almost exclusively white male police officers serving in the Met, bullying and harassing and a range of other things their female colleagues and other police officers of colour. And the range of allegations were, as I've described, the bullying, the sexual harassing, but also allegations of steroid abuse, destruction of evidence, the sending of inappropriate material and WhatsApp messages. There was a range of really difficult, kind of disturbing allegations. And the vast majority were proven. In the system that I worked in, it was about finding, is there a case to answer here for misconduct, gross misconduct, if you excluded the possibility of criminality. Now, that case was made for a number of officers, but we wanted the work to matter more than just individual accountability. How could you take this work and try and drive systemic change? So we used our legal powers to make a range of recommendations to the Met, which centred on culture, improving the culture, becoming more victim-centred. But to me, that still wasn't enough. What we wanted to do was we wanted to kind of expose what this culture looked like inside the Met to the wider public, but also to other serving officers. And in one key respect, if your lived experience is not of being a minority or not coming from a minoritized group or community, you won't understand this phrase, discriminatory content, offensive messages. I will understand that. Zoe, you might understand that in a particular way, but Paul, your lived experience might not lead to that level of understanding, and there's no blame attributable to that. But what we considered really important was to show what people have to suffer and have to put up with. So I made the decision to publish unredacted the WhatsApp messages that these officers exchanged in their safe spaces, which rooted in every possible form of discrimination that you can imagine. It doesn't sound like much. It doesn't sound like anything. But the thing is, it had never been done before. And that decision proved really controversial inside my organisation. And the truth of it is, I had to fight for that. There was a desire and a pressure on me not to include those WhatsApp messages. In fact, I was asked not to, and I refused. And I had to navigate and push and fight to make sure that they were included, because I was just absolutely convinced that if we got this out, it would lead to a different sort of conversation and understanding around when we speak about toxic police culture. What does it look like? Because instead of talking about it, you just point to it. This is actually what it looks like. But it was clear, after the debris of the things I had to contend with internally, that I was very much on my own with this. It was my risk. And in retrospect, I risked my career doing it, But I was just so convinced it was the right thing to do. So we publish it. And what I'd expected to get a certain level of attention wasn't inside, the kind of newspapers. It was on the front pages the next day. It really kind of sparked and captured the attention. But then it transcended the kind of normal traditional media, and it went into other outlets like Stylist magazine and different magazines, because what we had uncovered was the culture and the offensive messages, they offended just about every section of society. It was that bad, misogyny, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, ableism, homophobia. It was really all laid out. It was all there. And then and I had to do a range of media that week. And to me, it was really important to keep centred that there was victims at the heart of this. victims, not just WhatsApp exchanges, not just like this nebulous thing, a toxic culture. There was victims as the consequence of these officers' behaviour, and I tried my best to do that and deal head on with this metaphor of bad apples, just a few bad apples. No, just one bad apple rots the barrel, and it was a barrel I made sure to mention when I did media. It's the culture here that's the issue. Long and short of it then, the Mayor of London got involved, ultimately set Dame Cressida Dick an ultimatum. And by the end of the week after publication, the commissioner then had resigned. And the kind of startling thing and reflection for me there, Zoe, was that chain sequence of events wouldn't have happened if I'd compromised. If I'd compromised and just kind of given into the fear and the group thing and some kind of dubious conversations inside my organization around not publishing the WhatsApp messages, change wouldn't have happened. And I know that because a few months previous, we had spoken about Operation Houghton. We'd given the headlines, not any of the gory detail. There was no interest. There was no pickup in the media. So the kind of rather surreal experience at the end of that was the realization of how this had happened. But then this really weird thing happened where, people started reaching out on my social media to kind of thank me for the work. And that was quite difficult. That was difficult to process because the job that I did was inherently unpopular. You don't get flowers or recognition for doing the type of role that I did. But the thank yous originally came from members of the public, but then they started coming from serving officers inside the Metropolitan Police. And there were multiple, and they were women, and they were from ethnic minorities whose life had been made a misery. And then they were from other officers from across the country that messaged me privately to say, we've been saying this for years, but nobody's been listening. And to me, it was remarkable because the IOPC and the role that I occupied is traditionally seen as the kind of boogeyman in policing. It's the oppositional figure, and because of the tensions of what we're there to do. And yet, when we had actually delved inside the culture of one particular police force, the Metropolitan Police, and uncovered what we did, we spoke to a wider truth, and we uncovered a wider truth. And to this day, I still get reflections and feedback about the work that we did and what it mattered to individuals, to victims.
That's extraordinary. And thank you so much for shining a light right on the heart of the toxicity of that culture. And I can only imagine the pressure you were under when that was going on. And in the book, which I really urge everyone to read, you talk about the scrutiny, the intense scrutiny that came with that time and the other things you worked on and being a story on Newsnight. What was it like to live with that kind of pressure, and how did you cope?
I think this is the most difficult thing that I had to confront in the book. And it was like my own vulnerability, because my life has been built on my resilience. Like, we were the first, I grew up in Scotland. That's where the accent's from, obviously. And grew up in a wee town called Kilmarnock. We were the first Pakistani Muslim family to move there. And my childhood was just really difficult. It was full of hate. It was full of violence, full of racism, in a way that, my children would thankfully never understand. But, that kind of childhood forged, this true north that I speak about, this true north, which is, this fight that I have about just not giving up and getting back up consistently. The centering of my faith, I'm a Muslim, and that kind of keeps me centered. And my family, and, the strength that my family provides. If I hadn't had the type of childhood that I had, where I had to confront these things on a daily basis and deal with that violence, I wouldn't have been able to do what I had done in the system yet. And despite all that resilience, despite all that inner armor and everything that I had kind of given myself false assurances about would carry me through, the damage it did to my mental health when I was there, I only understood last year and writing each chapter down. So the way I can describe it, and I know, like, There's former colleagues of mine who will probably no longer speak to me for saying this. One organisation tried to break me from the top and from the bottom. And I detail how that played out. I detail, on one occasion, I ended up in hospital and I thought I was having a heart attack. And it was during that phase where we had lockdown, not lockdown, and you didn't quite know where you stood. And I remember booking the Uber. I remember going myself. I didn't want to fret anybody. I didn't want anybody to worry. I didn't even tell my children that I'd went. Only my wife knew. And, it took them 5 hours to rule out it wasn't a heart attack, but it was just a severe anxiety attack. And that was because of the bullying that was going on and the bullying that had kind of chipped away and worn away at me insidiously whilst I was fighting to drive change and fighting on all the other bits of work. I was fighting. And I hadn't realised, I had been eroded, in this kind of really insidious way. And I fell over. And it was the first time in my career, the first time in my life I'd ever been off work with any stress, ever. And to this day, my emotion, my overriding emotion, is not anger at the individual that put me there. It's shame. And I speak about that shame because I'm ashamed that I let somebody get the better of me and I didn't see it coming. And even speaking to you about it today is uncomfortable. And I still feel that shame. So you had that pressure, Zoe. But then you had this other pressure when you try to do the right thing and you try to kind of follow the role, which was to be independent and do the job without fear or favour. I experienced the other thing where, people try and break you, kind of bottom up, they call it upward bullying. And I detail how that went on for 4 years. 4 years where ultimately there was a witch hunt against me inside my own organisation where, I had grievances, whistleblowing allegations, then lies told to journalists about me. I even featured as part, not exclusively, but as part of a Newsnight story, which was lies, and I had no right of reply. And I had lies written about me fed to journalists, and again, no right of reply. And ultimately, this all ended up in court in an employment tribunal. So from the date I made this decision in this investigation to the time I appeared in the employment tribunal in court was 4 years, and it was last January. And essentially it was meant to be an employment tribunal about this former IOPC employee. But essentially it was a rerun of the decision I made in that investigation, and I was the star witness. But it was a surreal and amazing experience because not many people get to have their chance in court. That metaphor, literally, of having your day in court, I lived it. I lived that metaphor. And when you go through this process, you don't quite know what to expect. But I got this 2,500 page evidence bundle the week before to read through, and only going through each page did I understand how many people were actively trying to break me. And it was astonishing that I hadn't realized there were so many people had gathered round and didn't actually see me as a human being. They actually didn't even recognize that the thing they were alleging I had done, and I had disadvantaged complainants who were from the Black community, and this was the case around Bianca Williams and Ricardo dos Santos, the decisions I made in that case. They didn't see me or didn't see the melanin in my skin. And by the time I'd read the evidence bundle, I really struggled. I had to just take a moment away because I didn't know it had been as bad as that. I knew it had been bad, but I didn't realize what had fully been going on behind the scenes. So then when it came to the day in court, again, my family wanted to come with me. I wouldn't let them. I wasn't willing to put them in any sort of firing line, potentially journalists there, but also the individuals that had, orchestrated the witch hunt. I just didn't want them to be impacted by it. So like everything, I did it myself through choice and through protection. And this remarkable thing happened. I had 8 lever arch files in front of me of evidence, and I was able to navigate all that evidence. I was able to explain every single thing I did on the basis of evidence, and I was able to rebut every single lie that was told about me in the court in front of the tribunal panel of 3 very senior individuals, and not off the back of conjecture, off the back of evidence. And then the barrister that was representing the IOPC and representing me that day asked if there's anything else I wanted to say. And it gave me this wonderful opportunity, this really amazing opportunity to just describe my experience and what had happened to me over those 4 years, the impact it had, the impact it had on my family, but also what did it actually say about what racial bias looks like? What did it say about how people conduct themselves? See, racism in Britain is polite. It's not like it was when I was younger, when somebody would be standing there with a machete coming at me. I could deal with that, and I have dealt with that. I could see it. I knew what it was, and we both knew what that would take if they wanted to get the outcome they wanted. Racism in Britain is just polite. It's insidious. It's nuanced. It's gaseous. But it can be evidenced in certain ways. So, for instance, the different standards you're held to, the disproportionate criticism that you get, and the accumulation of experiences, when you package them up, what does that say? What does that say? So William McPherson, in his famous kind of definition of institutional racism, there was a bit in it that is very often forgotten, and somebody very kind reminded me of it recently, which is thoughtlessness. The manifestation of thoughtlessness in organizations is also an example of what institutional racism looks like. Now, I'm not saying that my former employer was institutionally racist. I can't say that. But what I can wholeheartedly say and believe in is that what experienced to me was the underlying current of it was racial bias. It was racism, because the experiences I had, the treatment I had was different. It was different. And ultimately, you're left with this complicated set of experiences. And then you have to fend off the caricature that people try to paint you in, and the boxes people paint you in. It said, well, he's playing the race card now. Oh, look, he's a race agitator. Oh, he's this, oh, he's that. Luckily, my validation doesn't lie in the conviction or belief what kind of trolls on Twitter will say about me. But what I have is the accumulation of my experiences that I've set out, and this really weird thing where I'm one of the most senior people of colour to have worked in the whole system. And yet, this still happened to me. So while I was on the public stage talking about the need to tackle the issues around race and policing, I was in this system getting absolutely battered just for trying to do the right thing. And why was I getting battered? Why was I?
Wow, Sal, thank you so much for sharing all of that. And you talked earlier about shame, and I really don't think any of that shame is yours to hold.
I mean, thank you, Zoe. Thank you, but I can't help it. I don't actually have anger, because, and this is where I come back to my faith. There's a phrase that I talk about, and there's a phrase I say as a Muslim, which is Alhamdulillah, which is I thank God. Now, it's easy to thank God in the good times, but every time I've had a challenge, I still remember God, because this was meant for me. And this set of experiences, if I hadn't had this set of experiences, I would have had a very thin book, put it that way. I would have a very thin book. It's nearly 400 pages, and that tells you the kind of experience I've had. But it was meant for me, and I am here, and I own my space confidently and apologetically. And although the system, and I will describe it as a system, although the system, tried to break me, I'm here, and I'm talking to your good selves today, and I'm whole, And that is because of the love I have from my family, my amazing wife and children, and my faith. And that thing, all that experience in my childhood gave me that fight, which is I keep turning up. You won't put me down.
How old are your children now, if you don't mind me asking?
My youngest is 14. My eldest is 29. So, like, I'm blessed to have a range of children who are now grown up, and a couple of them are married, and I can speak to them honestly about what it's like because I don't want them to have the pitfalls that I've had. So I'm able to pass on the benefit of my experiences to them. And a big part of this book also is sharing those experiences with others. So when I've talked about these experiences, I've also brought in some key concepts that we hear all the time, like, for instance, institutional racism. But this thing about ceilings, the class ceiling, the glass ceiling, the concrete ceiling, bring in concepts like the glass cliff. And I also, my very frank views about the fallacy of imposter syndrome. So when I've been talking things through as I go through the book, I've also rooted it in some key academic concepts and kind of research over the years and pinned it to that so that there's some rigor behind some of what I'm saying because it's very easy to dismiss some of these things. And I've experienced that in the past week when I put my book out and how some try to kind of marginalize and sensationalize what I'm saying. I think the wrapper of what I'm describing is sensationalist because of just the area that I worked in. But I guarantee you, the experience that I've had, you can replicate that, you can copy and paste that across every single system or industry where somebody who's kind of looked like me or been of a different from a different group or community has tried to drive change, they will have had a very similar experience. I guarantee you it's a copy and paste.
Yeah, that totally resonates with me. I mean, as we were saying before we started recording, even though I work in a very different sector to you, some of those experiences of being a person of colour really pushing at the boundaries of change and the level of scrutiny you feel and the different standards you get held to be seen as even 10% as good is really full on and is very hard to understand, I think, unless you are from a similar background, which is why it's so great that you've written this book and put it all out there in the open, because people need to understand what it's like. And it's something we really need to confront in our organisations and in society.
I mean, I totally agree, Zoe. And the fact that, I mean, if you, like I said, if you remove the kind of sensationalist wrapper of what I describe, there's kind of key things there around self-care, around welfare that I've learned the lessons on that I will never repeat the mistakes of again. There's also this point about the cost of driving change that I wanted to try and get across because it can absolutely burn through you. And it can burn through you in a way that you don't understand because at the time when I left my role, I had nothing left. And it was like kind of trying to put the foot on the gas when you're driving the car and realizing there's nothing's happening. It's not moving. Now, I shouldn't have got to the point that I did and become that depleted to understand that. But when you're the tip of the spear, and we've probably all experienced that at different point in our life, you're motivated by something kind of bigger than you. You're motivated by something else. Ultimately, organizations don't care about that side. They don't care about that side in the way that your loved ones will. If you go, the job description will go out, the process of backfilling will take place, and you will be replaced. And somebody else will carry on with that role. But if you carry on in the same way that you have done, and you are diminished, and you are lessened, and you are damaged, what is there left of you for others or for you to carry on? So I left because, I had to make a choice. And my choice was that, I'm going to prioritize myself. and my family, because my family needs me. My family needs me, and whatever I've done, is for others to judge. I don't make any proclamations of what I've done, but I tried, and I think that would be the key thing. One of the key things I'd want to get across, that somebody who is just a bang average um, guy from Scotland who grew up in Scotland with the experiences that he had, if I was able to tilt the system in the fraction of a degree that I managed to, then it shows me what is possible. It's what's possible. But also demonstrates to me the inertia in the system that's there currently, which is too often permeated by groupthink. And it's not just always the case of just the diversity you get from, greater ethnic minority representation or even better gender diversity. We've seen that from the last government. You know, it's not just about diversity; it's about representation. It's about representation and breaking down the groupthink by getting genuinely different thinking and different experiences in there to try and disrupt. What I did consciously at every point in my professional, in my time in policing, was to be disruptive, not in a behavioural way, but disruptive in terms of the things that I did, because change doesn't happen by staying inside the box. You have to go outside those borders, and going outside those borders, has consequences. But that's where change happens. No change happens by conventional thinking.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I wanted to ask you a bit more about change, because when we spoke, we talked about what it takes to create change and how there'll be leaders out there who do want to see the change that you're fighting for, and they might be struggling to push through some of those changes. What would you advise them?
I think one of the lessons that I learned in my time in the system was finding common purpose. And it was remarkable to me where I found common purpose. I found common purpose with organisations that had been fighting the IOPC for forever. And yet, when you broke it all down, when I left my ego at the door and I approached conversations humbly and said, look, this is the thing I want to focus on. And very often it was around issues to do with trust and confidence. It was whether it was racial disproportionality or whether it was to do issues around toxic culture. These were issues where there was commonality. And that commonality existed across stakeholders in policing, outside of policing. But also you found partners who you thought would be allies who weren't. But that was okay. So what happened, and I think I still have this legacy now, is I developed this really broad network that seen what I was trying to do at the IOPC and helped and supported. So when you're trying to kind of push for whatever change you are, identifying where there's common purpose and having a different style of leadership, which to me is not about me, but is actually what you're trying to do, removing your ego and trying to approach this as a kind of servant leader, it can sometimes lead to remarkable things. It can, because people will eventually see you, and they will eventually see you because they will see what you're trying to do, and you will then move from rhetoric to that key thing, which is action, and then the aspiration, which is always the change that everybody's wanting to see. So I think it's a big question, Zoe, but I think if I'm trying to give some sort of practical advice, is find common purpose with people, leave your ego, at the door, approach it humbly, and be open to where those allies are, because sometimes you'll find them in really unexpected places.
Yeah, that really tracks with some of the things that I've seen recently in the world that I work in, that artificial intelligence is really sort of disrupting the charity sector at the moment. And some of the allies that I found in very unlikely places have been such a brilliant surprise, and it really teaches you a lot, doesn't it, when you're trying to build a coalition of the willing about who shares your values.
Definitely. I was just thinking as you were saying that, when you were talking about leadership, that when, I don't know, people kind of view you and see the gloss of social media and they think about leadership training and stuff. I was thinking about leadership. I thought about leadership a lot when I kind of tried to capture my experiences. And my leadership style and my role model and the person I've modeled my kind of leadership on was my dad. Was my dad. And to this day, he's the standard I hold myself up to. I lost him a few years ago, which was really hard. But when I was growing up, I seen how he came into this hostile environment. He ran a shop, he bought his own business, convenience store, and he built himself and won himself a place in the heart of the community of all the wonderful people in Kilmarnock. And he did that not through fighting, he did that through kindness. He did that through the quality of his character. And he did that through dignity and grace under dignity, because he had to endure terrible things, worse than I did. And I was there with him to work little bit later. He had to endure terrible things. But he was centered in his faith, and he was defiant in the sense that he would just carry on. But the kind of the goodness of his character transmitted across the fact that he was this Pakistani Muslim man, that he was different, and people didn't see him as different. People just seen him as this kind of pillar of the community who was always nice, who was always friendly, who was always chatty, who was always remembered your kind of dad, or if your gran was sick, or who had seen generations grow up. And seeing that kindness and seeing that dignity is something that it still has a profound impact on me, and and how I carry myself, because it's dead easy. I've had to do a lot of media, and the media kind of is what it is and portrays the headlines and stuff in a certain way, but but the way I express myself is my choice, and there is strength in your reaction. So even very recently, when I stuck my head above the parapet and participated in a BBC Panorama documentary, I had the worst racist trolling and anti-Muslim hatred I've had ever. 500 plus separate messages of racism, of hatred about my faith, and 3 threats within that. I could go on and say X, Y, and Z. I'm not going to. I'm not going to, because my validation doesn't lie, with people who have hatred in their hearts for somebody who looks like me. It's not in that. My strength lies in my choice and how I choose to respond. And it's always in that. It's always in that. And it's one of the lessons that I carry from my dad, that it's how you are, it's how you conduct yourself, out of eyeshot when nobody is looking. What's your quality of character then? And he set high standards, so I haven't reached them yet, but I'll always aspire to.
And there's such a beautiful tribute to your dad in the book, and your closeness with him and the incredible effect that he had on you really, really comes across. And yeah, I can really see how it must have been such a brilliant North Star to have that guide at a time when you were having to deal with so much.
It was. I mean, you need role models, don't you? And obviously, I was very privileged to have an amazing one. My mum as well. I mentioned my dad, because I worked with him for a decade as well. But both my parents, set the example. They were pioneers, came to this country with nothing, and built a life for themselves. But that leadership and how he won people over through the quality of his character, I think that says a lot about what we sometimes miss in public life and in leaders. Because we always talk about, leadership. How many books have we read about leadership? My book's kind of about leadership as well, values-led leadership. But honestly, how many quality leaders have we met in our professional lives? Honestly, I've met two people who I would say had outstanding leadership skills. Exceptional leadership is exactly that. It's the exception. It's not the norm. If you're lucky, you'll get bang average. And if you're unlucky, you're quite likely to get toxic leadership or be exposed to it in some way, shape, or form. But we never speak about how we create leaders. How do we systemize some of that stuff a bit better? Now, I'm involved in a few spaces where I'm seeing some lovely thinking around that. But here's this hard truth: to lead in a values-led way and to lead in a really kind of true sense is hard, because you have to make hard choices, and popularity and leadership don't always sit in the same sentence, or sometimes even in the same paragraph. So when you are kind of operate in that environment, understanding your values, your true north, is incredibly important. Certainly it was for me, because it gave me a guide when at times I was in the darkness, and I then just centered on myself, and I thought, well, what do I want to do here? What is the right thing? And amongst everything that you had to consider professionally. And now that when I've left my former role, there are things that I've done I stand 100% behind. And I've realized I would never have reached that place if I didn't have this own internal moral compass that consistently guided me. If we had leaders that kind of really embody values led leadership that way, sorry, the world would be much better.
And that's the nut we need to crack, right? Because as you were talking there, you sort of really made me think about how some of the things that we teach leaders, I'm talking societal we, they're very much about the external, aren't they? They're, the nuts and bolts things of it's what you do and it's how you communicate and how you do these things. And yes, of course, that's part and parcel of being a leader. But it's that internal thing, isn't it, that really marks out, as you say, the exceptional leaders from those who will just come and go and people won't remember them in 10 years' time. Is that having that really strong core right at the center of you, where you know who you are, you know what you stand for, you know what your red lines are, you know what your values are. And that's the first thing we should be doing, right? We should be building the rest of leadership around that, not doing the moral compass thing as an afterthought. And I just love the fact that the way you lead has absolutely been centered around what those values are and really, really sticking to that.
It's the only way I know, Zoe, and it sometimes puts me in these really difficult spaces where I'm thinking, how did I end up here? I know how I ended up there because I've followed my values, and it's led me to difficult spaces, and sometimes the consequences of that can be hard. But the decision making of it, and people see that, and I think this is a question I would pose to yourselves, and but also listeners of your podcast, that think about those people that you really considered exceptional leaders. Then I'd ask you this question to reflect on: how are they outside of work versus inside of work? Because I would hazard a guess that they were the same, so that there was no difference. You would see that actually how they are and how they conducted themselves outside of work, there was a throughput of that and a consistency inside of work. I'd be really interested for people just to take that away and reflect on that point.
That's such a great question to pose of people. Thank you, Sal. And before we wrap up, can you tell people about where they can get your wonderful book?
Thank you. Yeah. So True North, a story of racism, resilience, and resisting systems of denial. It's available on Amazon in all formats, and it will be very shortly getting kind of released and available in all good bookshops.
And run, don't walk to get that book. It's a fantastic read. Sal, thank you so much. I think this has been the most moving podcast interview we have recorded in almost 5 years of having it and the podcast. And I just want to thank you for sharing your story. It's just extraordinary, the bravery, the courage, the clarity with which you own what you've done and you've been through, and the way you've turned all of that into the most incredible wisdom and resilience and shared it so generously with others says everything about your character. And we've talked so much about character and leadership today. So I just want to say thank you. It's been amazing, and you are amazing. And we hope you'll come back on this podcast in the future.
I would love to. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. And you talked about cost, and you talked about the shame that you feel. But I can absolutely guarantee you, and you must know, that everybody around you, including your family and your dad, would feel immense pride. The pride that I feel just being privileged to listen to this conversation. So thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Don't you get me emotional.
We're all going to end this interview in tears. Yeah, your dad would be so proud of you, Sal. It's everything you've done is such an extraordinary tribute and testament to you and your family. And thank you for sharing that with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much once again to Sal. And thank you for his honesty in sharing his story. It's definitely the most affecting episode we have recorded in many ways.
And as I said before, I think, sometimes as a leader, you have to learn to step back and leave space for others to shine. And this episode was one that I felt privileged to be a part of, Zoe. So thank you. I think all three of us found that very emotional, and I hope you enjoyed it as our listeners.
As always, we really do appreciate that you've listened all the way to the end of the episode, so thank you. You can support the podcast by leaving us a 5-star review wherever you listen to us. It really does help us reach more people, so if you've enjoyed what you've heard, do share us with a friend.
And thank you so much for listening today. We'll see you in a couple of weeks' time with a brand new episode of Starts at the Top. And in the meantime, thank you and see you soon.
See you then, and bye for now.